I woke up this morning, I thought, wow, everyone in Vermont is so nice. And now I just think they're even nicer. Yeah, I'll try not to tear up because I have to actually give you a talk. But I am thrilled to be here. I did teach a little bit. I would not say that I was a master teacher, because who becomes a master teacher in 5 years in the classroom? Who becomes a master anything in a very short sprint like I was doing in teaching? I think I learned enough about the classroom and about kids to understand that there truly is no more important profession, and definitely no harder one in the world. But one of the things I want to talk to you about is how very long it takes, it turns out, to get super, super good at anything. And I think that insight is really, that coupled with this intuition that really kids are our most important resource and teaching is the most important thing that any human being could do. That's sort of what brings me to my work. So let's get started. I also want to say that I'm going to try to reserve some time for Q&A. Towards the end of this, I guess we have, almost an hour together. And also during the break, I was very careful to go to potty before, so I don't need to go to the potty again. So between the morning presentations and this, I'm really happy to answer more questions, squeeze as much as we can get in here. Okay, so magically the slides go on, and then I just press F5, I think. Do I press F5? Okay, great. I'm going to skip that. Okay. So let me tell you what I'm learning about grit. I want to do a couple of things. I want to tell you what grit is and what it predicts, but I think what this group really wants to hear about is how to get more of it. So I'm going to go faster during the first part so that we can spend more time on the second part and definitely get to your questions. If you really want to know what grit is, if you look at this blue handout in your folder, and I really just mean look at it as opposed to fill it in, just to save time. This is what I think grit is. There are 5 questions on this questionnaire that have to do with good old-fashioned sticking to it, even when it's hard, even when you screw up. I screw up a lot, and I get rejection letters, and they are single-spaced and very long about how my article is stupid and obvious, but also illogical and poorly written. I get these, in my line of work, 8 out of 10 times, that's what happens. So 5 of these questions are being able to get a letter like that, to not do well on a test, to screw up a conversation with your 13-year-old daughter, to make mistakes, which I do a lot also, she'll tell you, but just to get back in the game again. So 5 questions are about good old-fashioned tenacity and doggedness. Not easy to do, but definitely something we've heard from our mothers and fathers before. But there are 5 other questions, and I'm so glad there are real live kids in the audience, students, because I think this is for you. Let me tell you that I don't think grit is just about being a hard worker and overcoming adversity. 5 of these questions, half of grit is passion. Half of grit is finding something you actually care about to get really good at. A sport that you would want to do not just 1 year, not just 2 years, but maybe several years, maybe all of high school. A concentration in your academics, a subject that you want to get really, deep into. So 5 questions are about having stamina, not in terms of your effort, but stamina in terms of your interests. And I think that's very important. It's very hard to legislate in things like Common Core. It's very hard to figure out how to put it in the right language so that you can, get this to happen. But the most successful people in the world are like the people in this room. They have found something that they really care about and that they, continually are interested in, and don't just say, oh, well, okay, I've done that, and now I want to move on. For me, it turned out not to be the craft of teaching in particular, but psychology. And, I intend to take my last breath on this planet working on, these psychological questions: the psychology of effort, the psychology of achievement, why kids sometimes give up when everyone else in the room thinks, oh my gosh, if you just tried a little harder, trust me, you would get it, why sometimes they do stick it out, and, what goes on in their heads in those moments. So maybe the most eloquent spokesman on what this is really like is Will Smith. I want to play you 45 seconds of an interview. The video quality is not great, but the context is this. The interviewer says, "So Will, why you, right? Poor black kid from Philadelphia with no connections ends up a Oscar-nominated actor and a Grammy Award-winning musician." So this is what Will Smith says.
The only thing that I see that is distinctly different about me is I'm not afraid to die on a treadmill, right? I will run.
You would not be outworked.
I will not be outworked,
right?
Period.
Yeah.
You might have more talent than me. You might be smarter than me. You might be sexier than me. You might be all of those things. You got it on me in 9 categories. But if we get on the treadmill together, right, there's 2 things. You're getting off first, or I'm going to die. It's really that simple.
So well before there was Will Smith with his, theory of success, right? What does it really take to get to the top? There was this man, Francis Galton, and for the historians in the audience, you can look him up. He was, far from a perfect human being. He had many failings and flaws, but I put him up here because he really was the first scientist to ask the question, who becomes successful in life? And what he did was very simple. He decided to look across as many different fields as he could think of. Poetry, art, music, sports, wrestling was one of the sports, rowing, the law, commerce. And he asked, if you look at the outliers in each of these fields, what do they all have in common? No matter what you do, how do you become great? And to quote directly from his summary conclusion, the truly eminent have 3 things: ability, or talent, you could call it, combined with zeal and the capacity for hard labor. In my language, I would say talent combined with passion and with perseverance. Now, Galton had a somewhat more famous cousin named Charles Darwin, and he read the book and wrote this letter back to his cousin. He said, at the beginning of the letter, he says, you've made a convert of me in a sense, for I've always maintained that individuals did not differ much in their intellectual ability, but only in their zeal and hard work. And towards the end of the letter, he concludes, and I still think that those 2 things are the most important difference. So it's worth pausing here, right? Obviously, one of the most profoundly important scientists in history, reflecting on what really makes for achievement in life, is saying, gosh, my intuition is that maybe talent has something to do with it, but wow, it's so obvious to me that passion and perseverance are, tremendously more important. And towards the very end of his life, Darwin wrote a biography of himself, an autobiography, and reflecting upon his own contributions, he said, I'm something of a plodder. I do get stuff, but I do not get it any faster than anybody else. But what distinguishes me from many other scientists who failed to come to the same insights is that every morning and every night, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, I worked on the same questions, and therefore I got somewhere. A few decades later, now we're in about 1915 or so at Stanford University, we come to another study of high achievement, and this comes from this woman who was a researcher there, Dr. Catherine Cox, and she did a study of 300 geniuses. She found geniuses for whom 2 biographies had been written, so she could kind of cross-check and really, in particular, look at their childhood traits. So again, a shout out for the students in the room. This is her looking at people who in adulthood were identified as geniuses, but then looking at their childhood and adolescent characteristics, what predicts achievement later on in adulthood. And she ranked the geniuses. They were all geniuses according to her, but A group, B group, and C group. So the A group were the super famous geniuses, the kind of the Beethoven, Mozart, Isaac Newton type geniuses that we've all heard of. The B group were in the middle, and the C group were like, those geniuses that somebody wrote a biography about, but nobody actually in the general public has any idea because they didn't make as much of an impression on history. They didn't actually accomplish as much. And she looked at the A group and tried to understand what made the A group different from the C group. She concluded the following, and again, I'm going to quote verbatim from her research report. 2 characteristics really leapt out. The first was the tendency not to abandon tasks for mere changeability, not seeking something fresh because of novelty, not always looking for a change. And in my language, I would say she's talking about consistency of your interests over time, getting deeper into your passions. And then the second thing, the tendency not to abandon tasks in the face of obstacles, perseverance, tenacity, and doggedness. And, just to put this all together, because I get as confused as you do, I think as an educator who's, trying to teach your classes and take care of bloody noses and, love your kids, it's very hard to try to, dip your toe into the scientific research and make sense of it all because there's so many words and there's so many people and nobody, uses the same language. This simple equation keeps me sane, which is to say that I think achievement does depend in part on talent. I do think there are some kids who just, God bless them, they learn so fast, and you don't have to do very much to get them to kind of progress and advance. And then there are other kids, God bless them too, who maybe learn a little slower than others. And as the remarks by Rebecca really underscore, I think there's a strong and long tradition in American education to obsess about differences in talent. My kids at age 8, I guess, took IQ tests to determine whether they were gifted and talented or, conversely, not gifted and talented. And I thought to myself, wow, age 8, lots of things change over the life course, and science is affirming that. I myself was tested for gifted and talented when I was in elementary school, and I'll just say it's so amusing to me that one year I tested in, so I was gifted. For whatever reason, they usually don't do this, they administered the test again. The next year I didn't make it, so I was non-gifted. And then I was, then I moved to a different school and I got tested again. I was gifted, so I guess I was borderline. I was almost gifted. But those labels and those tracks, and I'm not saying that they don't have any merit. It's not that there's no distinction to be made. I think they really can become self-fulfilling prophecies. And I will tell you, having gone to my high school reunion, that none of the kids who were in the gifted program actually ended up doing all that much. So maybe we should, put less emphasis in our education system on, talent and who's talented and who's gifted and who has the potential, who doesn't have the potential, and maybe focus, like so many Asian countries and European countries, where they have a very different culture, on effort, because effort is something that is as profoundly important as talent anyway, and very much something under the control of kids. Not easy to do, but definitely within their broader control. So what has science learned since Galton and since Darwin and since Cox about experts and about how to get really good at anything? Well, the modern day equivalent of this is a guy named Anders Ericsson. And he is, we like to call, the world expert on world experts. So he studies world experts. He goes to the International Sudoku Championship and the Scrabble tournaments, and he of course studies Olympic athletes, and he studies World Cup soccer players. And for example, he studies the kids who go to Juilliard for music, because they're in the control group for his studies, because what he really wants to do is compare them to internationally renowned musicians. So when he studies these people, this is what he finds. This is a graph from his own research. Skill is on the y-axis, and years of deliberate practice are on the horizontal x-axis. And the basic idea here is that Anders finds that any of us human beings start near zero in complex skills like, for example, since we're in Vermont, skiing. Nobody's born knowing how to ski. But then you get better at it, right? And I think the major insight is that the way that you get better at any skill, whether it be mathematics, writing a good paragraph, being a decent parent, skiing downhill, is that you have to do this stuff called deliberate practice. And the horizontal dotted line is just to suggest that it takes years and years and years and years of truly deliberate practice to have a shot at being world class. That's not to say that all of our kids need to become Olympic level, athletes, but I think it's a profound lesson when we think, what is it that gets us good at anything? And here are the 4 ingredients to deliberate practice. And to be doing deliberate practice, you have to be doing all 4 of these things, right? So for the students in the audience, and let me say to their teachers, and we're all students and we're all teachers, I guess, in a sense, you can start to think, how much of truly deliberate practice am I doing? And before you get carried away, let me say that even Olympic athletes at the peak of their career, they do a lot of practice, right? They do hours of practice a day. But when you actually quantify how much deliberate practice they're doing, it ends up being more like 3 or 4 hours a day. It's extraordinarily hard. So here are the 4 things. The first thing is you have to be working on something very specific that you can't do. A specific stretch goal, right? It's not like, I ask my 11-year-old sometimes, like, what are you doing? Oh, I'm doing my math homework. Okay, well, what is it? Page 39, evens. I was like, okay, yeah, but let me ask it a different way. So, Lucy, what do you think the learning goal is? Like, what is your math teacher trying to get you to learn? Page 37, evens. I mean, it's like, so if you're a student who is, looking at your homework, you need to know what you're working on. Just like when a coach says, like, hey, I want you to work, they don't say, like, go work on your soccer. They say, you know what, I think your left foot is sickling. So you have to understand what specific aspect of your skill. It has to be very conscious. You have to be very aware of what you're working on. It should be a specific goal and something you can't do. The part about not being able to do it, we're going to get to in the next slide, because it turns out human beings don't like doing things they can't do. And we avoid it at all costs. And that's what makes homework and studying and being in algebra and getting feedback on your essay so very hard. The second aspect of deliberate practice is that you really need full attention. You cannot be checking Instagram and also be doing deliberate practice. It takes 100% of your attention. In fact, many world-class athletes, even those who play group sports, dedicate a significant amount of their practice to practicing alone. For example, the basketball player Kevin Durant says he spends upwards of 75% of his time on the court alone. And you think, like, that makes no sense. How do you practice basketball alone? It's a team sport. But what he says is that he needs to be alone so that he can practice these, like, micro techniques that I can't even tell you about since I'm not a basketball player. And then he spends, 10 or 15% of time in pickup so he can integrate it into group play. And then the last sliver of time is actually playing in basketball games. So I don't know that kids can be alone. Certainly they can't be alone when they're in a classroom of 32 kids. But I think the lesson here is that wherever we can get the kids to concentrate 100%, and wherever the kids can ask themselves, where can I concentrate 100%? What do I need to do to be in a place where I can concentrate? I think that's an important take-home message. Third, to learn, you need feedback. So obvious, right? So obvious. Every Olympic athlete videotapes their performance and watches it as soon as they can. Because how will you know how to get better unless you know how you just did? But I don't think education does a very good job of giving kids immediate and informative feedback. And by the way, just to throw down the challenge, because this is the group of educators who would be able to pick it up, not just immediate feedback, but when I say informative feedback, it's not always just, oh, by the way, you got that wrong. And it's not just, oh, the answer wasn't C, it was A. It's often just a little bit more than that. Kids need to know something so that the next try, they have a higher chance of getting it. And sometimes it's not enough to say you got it wrong, and sometimes it's not enough to say you got this wrong and this is the right answer. But something, why did you put C? Let's talk about that, etc. The fourth aspect of deliberate practice is, as the UCLA basketball coach, John Wooden, might say, repetition, 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 right? And I don't mean drill and kill. I don't mean you should mindlessly do stuff. But what I mean is this. When undergraduates come to Penn and I have the opportunity to meet them, I give them this advice. It is easier to graduate from this Ivy League college with an A average than it is to graduate with a B minus average. And they say, why would that be? And I say, because if you are getting B minuses, you are always behind. And it is so hard for you to get into that next class with these shaky foundations and to actually do well. And it's the same thing that we see in experts. Experts do not practice to B minus. They don't like, oh yeah, I can kind of get down the mountain, now I'm gonna do the next thing, right? They practice to perfection. They practice to fluency. They practice to A plus. And once they have really, honed that specific thing that they're working on and they can do it relatively effortlessly, then they move on. So I think this is in the tradition of mastery-based learning, not sort of, kind of barely getting by and then everyone moving forward, but really, spending the time to do things very well in sequence before moving on to the next goal. Now, if you do all of that, what does it feel like? Here's Martha Graham, one of the greatest dancers and choreographers the world has ever seen, writing in the twilight of her life about what it was like to be a dancer. She writes, "It takes about 10 years to make a mature dancer. Dancing appears glamorous. Dancing appears easy, delightful. But the path to the paradise of that achievement is not easier than any other. There is fatigue so great that the body cries even in its sleep. There are times of complete frustration." Let me say it again for the students. If you're going to be great, there are times of complete frustration. There are daily small deaths. Right? The path to the paradise of doing really well is screwing up an awful lot. And it doesn't feel good, which is why I think, among other things, you need grit to do it. So very quickly, let me say that we have found that grit predicts things like winning the National Spelling Bee. And in the second year that we did this study, we had the kids keep a diary. And what we found is that not only does grit predict winning the National Spelling Bee, we can understand a little bit about the kind of practice that we're talking about, this deliberate practice, and what it really feels like. So we were kind of testing Martha Graham's hypothesis that when you're really doing deliberate practice, it's not easy and it's not fun. And in fact, when we coded the diaries of these kids into 3 groups, all the activities could be grouped into either deliberate practice, or in the middle bars, being quizzed by mom or dad. Mom says paranoia, and you say paranoia, P-A-R-A-N-O-I-A, paranoia. Or the third group where like reading and other things that kids did for fun that were verbal, right? And they if you read How to Win Spelling Bee books, they also encourage you to read a lot. Well, if kids rate these on a scale from 1 to 9 on enjoyment, it turns out that deliberate practice is the least enjoyable kind of practice. And if they rate it on 1 through 9 for effort, it is the most effortful kind of practice. In other words, it sucks. However, it's the only kind of practice that uniquely predicts how well you'll actually do in the final competition, right? It pays off. The path is tortuous, right? But the end is glamorous. So deliberate practice, the number of hours and minutes that kids spend doing that, is the only kind of practice in this study that predicted performance. Because we are a group of educators, let me also say something about being quizzed. It is good to quiz yourself. In fact, students, quizzing yourself is much more effective than rereading the textbook. Because when you reread the textbook, you have this familiarity effect because you just read that same paragraph and you're like, oh yeah, I've seen that before. But oh yeah, I've seen that before doesn't mean you actually understand it. So don't just like read your notes over again and you're like, oh, I feel like this is really familiar, I'm ready. What you do need to do is quiz yourself. But I think what the lesson here is that when you quiz yourself, you identify things that you can't do. You're like, oh, I actually didn't know how to spell the word paranoia. I thought I did, but I didn't, and then you have to go practice it. So I think the lesson here is that being quizzed is something that you do so that you identify what you need to practice, and then you have to go practice it. So do go quiz yourself, and there are many good books written about best practices in learning, and I will make sure that I forward them to Chuck and to Mike so that they can pass those along to you. Grit was the best predictor in our study of how much deliberate practice you would do. So I think this is the pattern that we're finding. Gritty kids, and adults do hard things like deliberate practice, and that in turn pays off in terms of their performance. At West Point, we've been studying grit for over a decade, and we find a very similar pattern. But at West Point, we find it's not just that grit predicts deliberate practice, which is, of course, very important. It also predicts something else that's just as important, which is merely showing up for what you committed to. So, yes, deliberate practice is very important, but of course, you can't do deliberate practice if you haven't even shown up to the game in the first place. And it was Woody Allen who once joked, but half seriously, that 80% of success in life is just showing up, right? And we find that the grittier cadets, when we go on day 2 of what they call Beast Barracks, which is that very first summer when you are 18 years old, and they try to convert you from a soft and squishy civilian into a hardcore military elite professional, that the grittier cadets are the ones who continue to show up by the end of that first summer, where they have their largest dropout over the course of the 4 years. So just to show you the graph, the grittier the cadet, the more likely they are to show up through that first summer, and it turns out the grittier they are, the more likely they are to graduate 4 years later, and grit is a better predictor of graduating from West Point, from showing up over and over again to your commitments, than any other variable in their data set, including the whole candidate score. What's the whole candidate score? Well, West Point calls it the whole candidate score because they expected, when they designed it, to measure the whole candidate, the whole, and in particular their talent. So it's a weighted average of your SAT score. High school rank is in there too. Measures of your physical talent based on objective tests of running and push-ups and so forth, and also expert psychologists' appraisal of your leadership potential. And it has exactly 0 relationship to showing up at West Point. You could be the most talented cadet or the least talented cadet. It has nothing to do whether you actually stick it out, either in the first summer or over the next 4 years. If you stay, if you show up to West Point and you stay, and you don't drop out, then whole candidate score is an awesome predictor of how you do. And I think we've seen this in our own students. Talented kids are so fun to teach if they'll show up for us, right? But that talent doesn't guarantee that they'll show up for the hard work that's required. We've studied this showing up in 3 other settings where people tend either to drop out or show up. The first group is sales, and in all of these groups, orange is the group that showed up and stayed. Blue is the grit score of those who dropped out. And in every group, sales, the Chicago Public Schools, and the Special Forces unit of the Army, those who are grittier are those who show up, and those who are less gritty are those who drop out. I'm going to skip a little bit just to say something about extracurricular activities. I am sure that in a state like this, extracurricular activities are not being overlooked or undervalued, but I want to just say something about a study that was done in 1985 by the Educational Testing Service. Yes, your friendly neighborhood SAT makers, right? They commissioned a study. I think it was the most ambitious and expensive study of college success that has ever been run in history. And what they did was they said, other than the SAT, which they had already created, and grades, what predicts being really successful in college? And the reason it was so ambitious is they followed 4,000 kids across all 4 years of college. And not only that, they didn't just look at how you did on your grades in college. They looked at peer ratings of who was really a contributor and an admirable member of the community. They asked all of the professors at all of the colleges to rate all of the students and to, in particular, highlight the ones who had really accomplished something in art, in music, in entrepreneurial activities, in academic activities, and then about 8 other measures of success. And the striking finding is this: they started out with 100 plus different characteristics that might predict success in college, and when they wrote the final report, it was all about one thing, which they called follow-through. And they defined follow-through as evidence of multi-year commitments in high school to extracurricular activities and demonstrated progression and advancement. And when you read the report, you really get the feeling that they were talking about grit. Kids who found something, typically sports, student government, but also for those who had to work, driving around and delivering newspapers or pizzas or whatever, something where they could demonstrate multi-year follow-through and progression or advancement, passion and perseverance for things that you really care about. And we did the same exact thing that they did, but we just coded the resumes of teachers. And we looked at their college extracurricular commitments, and we gave them points for multi-year things like, for example, this is a 6 out of 6 on our scale, member of the cross-country team for 4 years, so multi-year, voted MVP in senior year, right? And then also founder and president for 2 years of the university's Habitat for Humanity chapter. So 2 activities, both multi-year, both demonstrated high levels of commitment and advancement. And when you score a resume of a teacher for grit, you can predict all the same things as you can predict with a questionnaire. For example, it was the grittier teachers who stayed in teaching as opposed to dropping out during the school year. And I understand when people want to leave the profession for other things, but it's really not cool to drop out on your kids before June. Teaching effectiveness among those who stayed for the whole school year was also dramatically greater in the group that had, as college students, done something with grit. Volleyball, soccer, it didn't matter actually, interestingly, what they showed grit in. What mattered is that they showed grit in something. And I think this would be a powerful and wonderful message to our young people, which is to say it's not just about test scores, and it's not just about, working the system. You will be rewarded in life because the deans of admissions at Harvard and Penn and Stanford and other places are listening very hard to this kind of research and saying, oh, right, it's not just these narrow metrics. I want students in our class to have passion for something that they do and to demonstrate that they've been able to commit to it over time. So that's what I have to say about measuring grit, but also I think more profoundly what we can encourage in our students today. Now, building grit's the most urgent question, and before I say something about what I think is grit, I will just remind us that training your weaknesses, doing deliberate practice, is very much part of grit, but so too is students' identification of their strengths. And, I have 2 kids, and I'm not going to encourage them to, major in their weakest subject, right, or their least favorite subject. When they come home and they say, wow, I really hated doing volleyball in gym, I'm not going to turn around and say, well, maybe you should go out for the volleyball team. I think people should race their strengths, but like Usain Bolt, still the fastest human being on the planet Earth and ever, having found a strength of yours, right, say the 100-meter, right, having found that, I think it's still important to, within that, train the weaknesses that, of course, you have. So for Usain Bolt, the first 30 meters of the 100-meter dash are actually, relatively speaking, his weakness. He's a little slow, right? I'm kind of relatively slow, right? Not slower compared to me. But he's, 6'4" and solid muscle, and you can kind of forgive him for being a little slow to just get started off the starting blocks. But when you watch Usain Bolt train, he spends more time working on his starts because he can gain a lot from improving just a little in his weakness than he does in working his strengths, which are the last 30 meters. So yes, students should, do a lot of deliberate practice because they'll gain a lot from it, but I do think it's very important to, look at their assets, look at their natural interests, and encourage the choice of what they do based on that. One of the mindsets that we see characteristic of gritty people is that they are doing what they are doing. And you're like, okay, well, what's that? Aren't we all doing what we're doing? No, because some people are doing what they're doing, but also kind of daydreaming about other things they could do that might be actually even better. And in psychology, we call that a counterfactual, sort of some imaginary thing. Like if you didn't come here to the Rowland Foundation's event today, where would you be? That's the counterfactual. What else I could be doing? And on day 2 at West Point, we asked the cadets to tell us, if life had turned out differently, and they hadn't come to West Point, well, where would they be? And they generated these counterfactuals, they wrote them down, and kids said things like, I would be at Yale, one kid said I would be on my dad's farm, one kid said he'd be the quarterback at ASU, and then they had to rate them in terms of, whether they thought that this imagined other ending to their lives, the other path, the path not taken, was better, worse, about the same. Or my favorite group, 7% of cadets said, I can't really answer that question because I cannot imagine doing anything else. And I'll tell you that I recently had the privilege of addressing the Teachers of the Year. National Teachers of the Year conference happened to be in Philadelphia. And I would say that the large majority of those master teachers said, wow, what else would I do if I were teaching? I don't know. This is so part of who I am. It's hard for me to imagine anything else. And what we found at West Point was that when we grouped these counterfactual styles into, if I think about something, it's worse, or I can't imagine anything at all, compared to, I can actually think of a few things that would be actually better than here, what we found is that gritty individuals at West Point have a counterfactual style which really focuses them on what they are doing, not on what they could be doing that might be better, and that in turn predicts their retention. So for the millennials who I've hired, who are constantly scanning, well, I don't usually hire this, but if they present this, then I don't hire them. So when I interview a 22-year-old and they're just constantly like, should I work for you, or maybe I should work for this, and maybe I would be marginally better off if I were at Berkeley doing that. I think that that's valuable to do in small doses on occasion, but I think if you're constantly scanning the horizon and like, could be better over here, then you're not doing what you need to do, which is concentrate on where you are. So this style of thinking about where you are, as opposed to the grass is always greener, is characteristic of gritty people. So the second thing that I think gritty people do is they have a mindset that Carol Dweck, and this is her book, I haven't written one, but she has, and you should all read it. So what she has called the growth mindset. So in addition to focusing on what you are doing, as opposed to what you're not doing, it's very helpful to have a growth mindset. What is a growth mindset? Well, we already heard a little bit about this, but let me just say that the questions on the growth mindset questionnaire, which those of you who are joining me in my workshop will get to read it in detail, say things like, intelligence is something that you can change. You can get smarter if you try harder. It's possible not only to learn things, but even get better at learning. Now, I read those questions. Yesterday, I was at a large real estate conference, and I only did that, so a lot of my speaking is determined by favors. Mike, Chuck. My husband's a real estate developer, but I did get to meet 500 real estate developers, and it's interesting that for a lot of them, when I read them those questions, they had this very puzzled expression. They're like, what do you mean you get smarter? What do you mean that your IQ can change? That doesn't make any sense. You can't change your IQ. And then I said, you probably have a fixed mindset. And that's okay, because I used to have a fixed mindset too, but the neuroscience evidence, among others, have convinced me that something like the ability to learn, which you would think, well, you can't change that about a student. I mean, you can give them stuff to learn, but how could you change their very ability to learn? It turns out you can. And again, for the young people in the audience, neuroscientists are now coming to the conclusion that there are two periods of really tremendous brain development in life. The first is actually before you go to school, so the ages of 0 to 5. And that's all in the family, and that's kind of beyond the reach of your teachers. But the second one is adolescence. So brain development is faster and more profound during the years of adolescence than during any other time in the lifespan. But good news for the rest of us who are no longer in puberty, not that we'd want to be, but brain development, it turns out, goes on the entire life course. We are always learning. The brain is always remodeling. There is plasticity really in every decade of life. So it isn't possible, in fact, to change things about yourself. And personality, by the way, is something also that's been demonstrated now to not be entirely fixed about you. You can actually get less or more shy, less or more gritty, less or more self-control, depending on what you do in life and what happens to you. And we find in our research together, Carol and I, that growth mindset students are those who are gritty. So the growth mindset seems to predict being a gritty student. That in turn predicts doing well in high school. That in turn predicts doing well in college and beyond. Now, We are trying to change beliefs about studying and practice, and for those of you who are really excited about this, and you teach middle school or high school, and you say, wow, I really want to get involved, then we actually are doing activities specifically designed for students of that age. I'll skip the activity here because of the interest of time to get to your questions, but you can certainly email Chuck, and then Chuck will email me, or maybe you'll just find me. I'm the most Googleable Duckworth grit person there is, so if there are other Duckworth grit people, Google hasn't found them. But do get in touch. Okay, so I want to sort of round out the end of my remarks by just saying that I have personally discovered, and it's a surprise to me, really, that grit is not just about you. In other words, it's not just about you being a gritty person and persistent. It's very much about having people around you who, on your bad days, can be gritty for you. I call that surrogate grit. So let me read you this story. This is a swimmer who did very well. He went to the Olympics, and he looks back after retirement upon his childhood, and he says, when I was 11, I wanted to bag it because I was doing very badly. My dad, at that point, did something very important. He said, if you want to quit, that's fine, but I don't want you to quit because you're losing. So I'm going to continue to drive you to workouts and force you to swim, and when you turn 12 and are at the top of your age group, you'll start to do well. If you want to quit then, that's fine. I'm going to make the argument that every teacher in this room has had this conversation with a student because they feel like they can't do it, and you know that they can. And you have something that nobody can ever have enough of themselves, and that is psychological distance. This is the term that we use in psychology to explain how, when an individual is experiencing a bad day, a meet where they not only lost, they just screwed up, right? It was actually their fault. That's even worse than, something happening to you. Mistakes that are made, we experience in a very egocentric way. It just, we're kind of immersed in them. And it's very hard for us to be objective and rational. But people who love us, our teachers, our dads, our moms, our uncles, our aunts, our grandparents, our coaches, our tutors, these people understand the situation and they have that psychological distance. And I'll tell you that even MacArthur winners come home crying some days, and they need, their spouses, for example, to say, honey, it's going to be okay. I know you want to quit, but in our family, we don't quit on a bad day. And I say, oh, I know, I gave you that rule, and now it's coming back to bite me. But, if you feel despondent, depressed, I just read the interview of T.S. Eliot, of course, one of the greatest poets ever, and he said, there was a time in my life that I was quite depressed, and someone who read one of my poems took the time to write to me and say that it moved him. And I'll tell you, it made all the difference. So, even the very greatest people, I think, in their field stumble sometimes, have crises of confidence, and it's not always that we should expect them to be gritty for themselves, but in fact for other people to be gritty for them. And then lastly, I just want to say something about culture, because sometimes economists in particular, economists and policymakers ask me why I care so much about schools and about teachers, because they say, well, it's all in the family, right? It's all in the family, you can't change the parents, so to hell with it. And I say to them, schools are powerful influences on students because at school there's a culture, and human beings are cultural animals, and we very quickly figure out what's done in this culture. What do you say here? What do you eat here? How do you walk here? How do you talk here? And schools and school leaders and school teachers and students have an opportunity, therefore, to craft a culture. For example, a culture that embraces grit, mistake-making, risk-taking, screwing up, but learning, growth mindset, and deliberate practice. I won't go through all these examples. I will just say something about sisu. Sisu is a word in Finnish that translates roughly to grit, but literally means guts. It literally means your intestines. And the reason why people in Finland get it tattooed on their arms is because in Finland, which is only a country that has 5 million people, it's not the world's largest country, but you probably know it's one of the most educationally high-achieving countries. In Finland, they believe that if you are Finnish, you have sisu. And if you're not Finnish, unfortunately, you don't. Now, this sisu, this inner strength and determination, is what gets you through really hard things in life. And thank God the Finns also have a growth mindset about sisu, because young children in Finland are told when they struggle to do something and fail that it's so terrific that they tried and failed because their sisu got stronger and bigger. Now, I don't really believe there's anything like locked up in the side of Finnish people that we don't have, but it's a wonderful metaphor. And I think to develop a school identity, at this school, when we try things and we fail, it's a good thing because we're developing character. That would be a very powerful thing, and that's what I say to the economists and the policymakers. Schools have something very powerful in their quiver of arrows, and that is culture. And there's no more powerful motivator for human behavior than culture. I'm going to end with Pete Carroll. So he was another one of those coaches who called me. He was really nice. I called back the ones who were really nice. And also somebody on my team was like, "Oh my God, you should call him back. He's the coach of the Seahawks." I was like, "Okay." So we're on the phone to Seattle, and he has his entire coaching staff presumably huddled around their speakerphone in Seattle. And we talked about grit and growth mindset. I'm not sure I told him anything he didn't know. But this is an interview with Pete. We'll end here with his interview the day after they won the Super Bowl 43-8.
Now, you just said something about learning how to deal with individuals and looking for a certain person or a certain type person. I know when I was at the Niners, you were there. It meant something to be a Niner, not a football player. When you and John Schneider are looking for a player, tell me, what is that philosophy? What does it mean to be a Seahawk? What is that player that you're looking for?
I'm not going to give it all to you, but
come on, man, give it to me, Pete.
I will tell you that we're looking for great competitors. That's really where it starts, and that's guys that really have grit and the mindset that they're always going to succeed. They've got something to prove. They're resilient. They're not going to let setbacks hold them back. They're not going to be detoured, by challenges and hurdles and things. That mindset that really could be interpreted like you have a chip on your shoulder. I mean, we have so many guys that have something to prove. It's that attitude, and we really refer to it as grit. That's when you have that, you overcome a lot, and it makes you a really competitive guy. So that's the basics I'll tell you about it.
So thank you so much for your attention. Let's do about 10 minutes of questions and answers. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so I think there are 2 microphones, and then why don't you all just run around and give them to whoever? Yeah, and there is no, there is not. There's one microphone. There's one microphone.
You have a second microphone? Okay, great. Taking questions?
So while we're waiting for the mics to go around, how about stand up in a really big voice?
Right yes, yep. Use your teacher voice.
Excuse me.
So I just wanted to...
Oh, Melissa. Excuse me, Melissa.
Oh, sure.
Hi, can you just identify yourself?
Oh, sure. I'm Melissa Clark. I'm from Winooski High School. I teach math 9 through 12. And I just had a question for you on deliberate practice over time and the concentrating 100%. So as a psychology background, I know that there are different ways that students learn, and a lot of times students have questions on music. And I concentrate better when I listen to music, and so I just wanted to hear your take on that and concentrating 100% of the time listening to music.
Yeah, it's interesting. I went to a high school recently, and I was talking to 18 seniors who are graduating, and 17 out of 18 said, I do my homework better when I have Instagram open on my laptop. The last student, the 18 out of 18 students said, really? I don't know. I kind of have to go down to the basement where we don't have wireless and just get my homework done. And I said, you're right. So I will say this. Now, there are different, if the kid would do his homework with music as opposed to not doing it at all because he doesn't have music, then I guess it's better to listen to music. But in general, concentration is it's divided. It's a finite amount, and it's divided. I'll give you the suggestion of a 5th grade teacher, and she told me that this is what she does. She has students do she has 2 math worksheets, and they're of equal difficulty, right? And, we all have access to things like this. And she has them do it with, music on and other things, and then grade themselves, how well they do, and then has them do it again without music, and then they can see for themselves, right, whether in fact they are better. So I would just say a general rule is that students can become their own psychologists. They can run little experiments on themselves. What would it be like for me to try to get my homework done, before dinner versus after dinner? They might come up with the, conclusion that for them it works better here than there, but the point is that they become, the ones who are the experimenters as opposed to us experimenting on them. Great question. Yeah.
Hi, Angela. My name is Julian Portilla, and I'm on the school board in Winooski also. And I have a question about, I love the work and I love the notion of grit, and I think it's fantastic. And I'm curious if there is a line between teaching grit and setting expectations for greatness that might lead to more frustration than success. And also, if you have some ideas about how to inspire creativity in the midst of the kind of repetition and the practice and the kind of things that could become rote, how do you maintain that sort of spark of creativity?
Yeah, thank you. Those are 2 very challenging and therefore excellent questions. The first one is, if we talk about Olympic athletes and Martha Graham and Will Smith, are we setting our kids up for disappointment, right? Because there can only be so many Martha Grahams and Will Smiths in the world. And sometimes my kids will say the same thing, or, why am I practicing so hard? I'm not trying to be, nor ever will I be, Mozart, right? Because they play instruments too. And I think what I'm trying to communicate to them and what I say is that it is the pursuit of excellence in what you do, right? Like today I was served by this very nice waiter at the hotel. He obviously, to me, took his job very seriously. He was very friendly, he was very professional, I so appreciated that this young man, strove to excellence in what he was doing. And that's what I want for my children. I want them to strive to excellence in their vocations and in their avocations. And if they never reach the dotted line, still I think there is a kind of dignity. Aristotle said that the true meaning of happiness is to strive towards excellence in what you do. So it's just that, the striving itself, the process of trying to get better, even if you don't, win the tournament or get named, most valuable player. I think that's the lesson. It's hard, right? Because it's a subtle, kind of message that you're trying to communicate, but that's the one I think is really the most important one. The second question was about creativity. The first time I did a TED Talk, the people who invited me were the Blue Man Group. And I'm on the phone, right? And I'm like, wait, aren't you the guys who dress up in blue paint and blow cereal out your nose? And they were like, yeah, that's us. So I said, well, why would you want me to come give a talk on grit and self-discipline when, you guys are the most creative people, right? And they're like, oh yeah, well, the whole TED series is on creativity. And that's why we want you to come. And here's what they said. So, I think the resolution of this paradox between repetition and focusing on skills and then that kind of openness and free association that you need for creativity, I think the resolution is this. What they tell me is that there is a kind of element of free association and I don't know, what if we put this and this together? What would happen? And that's not necessarily a gritty process. But there then happens to be so much problem solving, engineering, practice to take that cool idea and actually make it something useful that they think, this expression attributed to Thomas Edison, 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration is roughly accurate. So yeah, there definitely has to be inspiration and laughter and kind of like, I don't know, let's see what happens. But there also has to be a tremendous amount of hard work. And they would argue, just in terms of their waking hours, it's more the hard work than it is the kind of, the frivolity, which is also super important. Chuck, you're in charge, so I know that it's 10:30, so you want to, you're in charge. Okay, good.
Hello, thank you, Angela.
Oh, there, thank you.
My name is Melissa Wyman. I teach at Hartford High School down in White River Junction. My question is, we know that grit is a skill that any student in our classrooms has the ability to achieve. On a spectrum, it's often identified as a masculine characteristic. So how do we start to break that barrier with all students in our classroom so that this becomes an accepted trait that they can leave our schools and bring into the real world?
So are you, you're suggesting that, for example, girls in the class may not think that just to probe a little bit, like the girls might think like, oh, that's a guy thing. Yeah. Okay, well here is a very simple answer. So on the back of your grit questionnaire, which by the way, nothing my lab does is for sale. Everything is free. You can photocopy it, you can hack it, you can rewrite it so it's better, you can do whatever you want with it. You can give this out in your class, and then you might explain to kids, well, look at the 50th percentile line, right? The average man is 3.3 on our grit scale, but the average woman in our sample is 3.5. So why is that? I don't know. Let's have a class discussion, but it certainly undermines the stereotype that grit is something of the, of the male species and not of the female. Maybe one more? Yep.
One more question?
And I will stay, so, for those of you who have, yeah.
Hi, Angela. My name's Elijah. I'm over here.
Okay, wait. Okay, hi.
Hi, I'm one of the principals in at Randolph Union High School, and I have 2 small boys at home. Obviously, there are important implications for your research for school-age children, and that's why we're here, because we work with those kids. But I was curious about what are the social policy implications of your research for those kids who are age 0 to 5 and the environments in which they grow up?
Yeah, well, let me say something that Walter Mischel, who gave us the marshmallow test, which, by the way, he just wrote a book, and it's really good. So if you are into that kind of thing, you should absolutely go read it. But Walter Mischel said to me once, relatively recently, Angela, as a psychologist who has studied self-regulation and motivation for 50 years, and as a father and a grandfather, I would tell you that the beginning of life, those early years, even before the child sets foot in the classroom, are among the most important years, maybe the most important years in development. So we have culture and schools and so forth, but then there is that early period of brain development and all the habits, even apart from brain development, the habits that kids, and the attitudes that they'll carry with them. So here's the implication. One is, it is incredibly important, right? Just to acknowledge that it's not kind of like, oh yeah, well, it doesn't matter. It absolutely does. You probably already knew that. 2, I would say that for those of you who really are in that, God bless you, those years of parenting, there's a book that I read when I was a parent of kids at that age that's done by scientists called Tools of the Mind. And they suggest that in those early years, children are learning to use all kinds of tools like forks and spoons, but they're also developing mental tools like planning and reflection. And if you do intentional things like, for example, play, which is something you see little kids do, and you might wonder, oh, that's cute, like they're playing, but they're actually, in many ways, practicing the use of mental tools, like theory of mind, empathy, as I said, planning and reflection. So a concrete recommendation is to go buy Tools of the Mind off of Amazon and read it. And it actually is organized by year. I think it's like the first year of life, the second year of life, etc. And then I guess finally I'll just say this. Deliberate practice, when you look at world-class athletes in adulthood doing it 3 to 4 hours a day, you don't want to make the mistake of thinking that 4-year-olds or 9-year-olds or 16-year-olds should also be doing 3 to 4 hours of truly deliberate practice per day. I think in the beginning of life, there's, exploration, there's goofing off, there's, running around. I think that in my own family, what we tried to do is when our kids had started off on their path to, playing the viola or the piano, was to, for example, say, hey, you're going to be playing the piano for like 20 minutes today. Maybe 1 minute 60 seconds could be deliberate practice. And so they would like goof off and play chopsticks and do these things. But then for 1 minute, they would try to actually do deliberate practice. And it was very hard for them. And then I would ask them how it felt. And then, you know, as they got older, maybe 2 minutes, you know, maybe 4 minutes. And now they're up to, I guess, well, in the case of one daughter anyway, 30 minutes of deliberate practice. So I think one of the things I just want to emphasize for young children is that, you know, looking at Martha Graham in full maturity doesn't mean that, you know, little children should just be miniature Martha Grahams. I mean, I think there are different requirements, and absolutely we wouldn't want to kill their interest, for example, by, you know, sledgehammering, you know, deliberate practice when they're not ready for it, and they're not mature enough for it. So thank you. These are terrific questions. I guess I get to turn it over to Chuck again, but really thank you. This is like the most important audience that I could ever be talking to, right? Yeah, so thanks.
Hello, everybody. Angela Duckworth.